My name is Cathy Dement Roos. I'm the eldest daughter of William C. Dement. I was a baby when he did most of his early REM sleep work. In fact, his lab was in our apartment in New York City. And he used to have subjects sleep overnight in part of our apartment. And I'm not sure, but I think NIH was actually paying part of the rent, and that's the only reason we could afford an apartment on Riverside Drive. I don't think my father recorded me when I was a baby, but when we moved to Stanford and I was fairly young, he paid my sister and me $10 each to sleep overnight in his lab, and he put all the EEG wires on us. And then we were going to spend the night. And my sister chickened out. She was 2 years younger than I was and went home. And he paid her the $10 anyway. And I was very, very unhappy about that, because as anybody who's ever had those wires on knows, they're not that comfortable and they're really hard to take off. So that's the only time I was a subject. I did work the first summer that my father and Mary Carskadden ran sleep camp at Stanford. That was my first summer after starting college, and I worked at sleep camp the first year, which was a great experience. I was one of the counselors, and sleep camp was a wonderful research experience. They were able to follow the same kids through adolescence, and they would come in for a week, and it basically was like being at camp, except that you had to take naps and you had to wear wires 24/7, but to keep the kids from misbehaving and from just leaving, we had to make it fun. So at lunchtime we'd play volleyball, we'd walk over to the Stanford Student Union, where in those days there was a bowling alley, and we'd go bowling. We'd show movies, we'd play games. So it was really like being a camp counselor, only that's where they developed the Stanford multiple sleep latency test, using the data from that series of experiments. Well, a lot of them were my brother's friends. And so their parents were Stanford faculty and knew my father, so they trusted him. And it was not, it was held in a dorm on campus, so it was not like you were sending your kid far away to sleepaway camp. But a lot of the people who worked there were either Stanford students or friends of mine. So it was very much a family research project in some ways. I intended to go to Stanford my entire life, but I wanted to see, in those days, if you were a faculty kid, you could get in with C's, and I had worked really hard, and I wanted to see if I could get in someplace on my own. And so I applied to Harvard, because people said it was the hardest to get into. And then when I got in, my dad happened to be doing something on the East Coast, so he took me with him so I could look at it. And I fell in love. It was so different from what because I'd grown up on Stanford campus. We literally live on the campus. And it's, Harvard is brick and ivy, and it was not at all a intellectual choice. I just sort of fell in love. No, I never did. Although I'm taking it now. At his 80th, he was very concerned that it would continue after he could no longer teach it, and he was looking for someone to take over for him. And at his 80th birthday party, he asked Rafael Pelayo to start co-teaching it with him. And they co-taught for the next 5 years, and then my dad was really too ill to keep lecturing, but he continued to go to the class until practically the day he died. In fact, the year he died, I was taking him to the class every day, and he would sit in the audience and they would mic him so that if he wanted to contribute, he would just interrupt. So he sort of continued to teach the class. And then the pandemic hit and the classes went to Zoom. But in the hospital, he was watching the classes on Zoom in the hospital, even up until he passed away. So that class was so, really, I think in the end, it became he felt it was one of his most important legacies, because it was the first class that anybody taught on sleep. And sleep education was a huge passion of my father's because, and this I do remember very clearly, I remember how uneducated the world, and particularly America, was about sleep, that people knew nothing. And he found that so alarming. So he was a crusader. He, on the subway, he'd tell you about sleep. He would lecture to anyone who would ask him for a while. Eventually he became too busy, but he felt it was so important to get the word out that sleep was important and that you needed sleep. And at sleep camp, we actually did every once in a while, and my memory isn't that clear on this, but I remember that we had a group of sleep apnea patients that we were running through the same tests that we did on the kids, basically trying to determine how sleepy they were. So one was the napping. You'd put them in a dark room and see how long it took them to fall asleep. But I also remember that there were addition problems and subtraction problems, boring. And then a serial alternation test where you just tapped back and forth like this. And I remember just being stunned because these men couldn't stay awake, tapping their fingers. They were falling asleep right away. And I couldn't imagine that kind of sleepiness. But I don't know if it was that particular study, but my father noticed that a lot of his sleep apnea patients were truckers. And that's what got him involved in sort of his crusade to get the transportation industry to start paying more attention to the fact that their drivers and pilots were too sleepy and it was unsafe, because there was no awareness of that. And our culture is still not very good about that. But in my own life, I see the difference that, kids now, my kids in their psychology class and in their PE class, there was a unit on sleep health. And in my New York Times crossword puzzle, sleep apnea is frequently a clue or an answer. And, back then, nobody knew those words. And I think that my father was a big part of bringing awareness to the world. So my grandparents like to say that my parents never grew up. They loved to have fun and they loved having kids. So at a time when a lot of parents went out without their kids, my parents frequently included us, in things that maybe the other adults would have liked us to have been left behind. So my dad took us to a lot of the meetings, and basically our house was full of sleep researchers. I sort of considered them all benevolent uncles. Michel Jouvet from France was in and out of our house all the time. He and my dad were dear, dear friends. And Lugaresi from Italy, Kazuo Azumi from Japan. He came over and spent a year in Stanford. And you won't need this for the archives, but it's such a funny story. We loved to play. People would come to our house and my mother would say, "Do you want to play croquet, badminton, or Scrabble?" You didn't have a choice. Which one would you play? But at dinner parties, we like to play murder and sardines after dinner. And murder is a detective game, but sardines, somebody hides. You turn off all the lights in the house, someone hides, and then everybody wanders around trying to find them. And when you find them, you don't say anything, you hide with them. And you call each other's names, Bill, and Bill answers until he finds the person. And then finally there's one person left wandering around. And so we played this when Kazuo Azumi was first here from Japan. he came to dinner and we played sardine, and his English was not, he hadn't been here very long, so his English was not yet very good. And he misunderstood the game. And so instead of looking, when the lights went out, he hid. And so it was just very funny. And then his mother came over to visit him while he was at the sleep lab, and for him to choose a wife. And she brought pictures of many prospective brides, but they had us over, our whole family over to his apartment. And we were little kids, and they had Japanese food, and as little kids, as you can imagine, we wanted nothing to do with little dried, I don't know if it was dried starfish or dried, I can remember it vividly, looked like little dried octopus legs. And at the end of the visit, my mother's purse was full of Japanese food. But my father's lab was a very open place, just constantly people. If you wanted to learn, he embraced that, and you could come. Tom Roth mentioned Elliot Weitzman doing a sabbatical year there, but so many of the older sleep researchers, I remember them coming to Stanford and spending time. And if you wanted to open a sleep clinic, my father was happy to go and advise. And as I mentioned at the meeting, I was recently in Walla Walla, where my father grew up, and I spent a lot of time with Dick Simon, who opened the first sleep clinic there. And he told me, which I did not know, that my father literally walked into his practice, just picked, oh, here's a medical practice, walked in the door and said, you're not treating patients with sleep disorders well enough. You need to do better. And that was the beginning of a relationship that lasted the rest of my father's life. And they built a thriving sleep practice in Seattle. And that sleep clinic is named after my grandmother. It's the Cathy Dement Sleep Clinic. I thought that my father was shy and didn't want it named after him, so he asked them to name it after his mother. But Dick Simon told me that they assumed the Stanford Clinic would be named after my father, and so they didn't want to do that. So they picked the next best thing, which was his mother. So I'm probably the wrong person to tell about it because I wasn't there, but I just remember. So Tom Roth and I were talking, and he said one of the things that was kind of amazing to him about my dad was he got very involved in, the way Tom put it was he made these things happen sort of through the force of his own will. Nobody else had the time or the energy, and he was just like the Energizer Bunny. And he didn't know anything about lobbying Washington. I mean, I know there are lobbyists, but he just started looking up representatives. And when he was in Washington, he'd go see them and give them his spiel, depending on, what he was interested in were different things. At first, it was trying to get the commission where they would investigate the state of sleepiness in America. And then once the commission had made its report, he was trying to get funding for the National Center for Sleep Disorders. And if he heard that our neighbor was going to Washington, he'd look up who their representative was, give them talking points, and just through his sheer charisma, he'd convince them to go talk to their representative. And Tom said my dad convinced him to go only once, but any sleep researcher, any just Joe off the street, if he could talk them into going to Washington and talking up sleep, he would. And I don't think that those things would exist without him. Eventually, he hooked up with Dale Edgar, who gave the lobbying a little more formality, but my dad sort of invented his own version, and got very interested in politics through that, but mostly to advance the cause of sleep research and sleep awareness. I'm the wrong person to give the facts about, because for me, it's all one big historical blur. And it was more social than than not. So I was unaware when one organization became another, because for me it was the same cast of characters. It just got bigger. So Al Reckschaffen was Uncle Al, and was in and out of our home, had dinner parties. The early meetings, I didn't realize it was any different organization than the current one. And so my memory, because it was when I was home, a family, is more the earlier, when it was just, this few sleep researchers gathering together. They would rent an airport hotel, room, and 20 guys would read papers to each other. And in the early meetings, one of the highlights for us, because we were kids, was that my father's lab would always play Al Reckschaffen's lab and touch football. And it was a very, very intense rivalry. And who would go home the winner this year? When we first moved out to Stanford, it was sort of a cow town. There was not much culture there. There were fields, fruit trees everywhere, no Silicon Valley. Our family home that we built across the street were circus horses, which we discovered when my parents liked to play music really loud. And the horses started running around in a circle because they'd been trained. Al Reckschaffen said he was always trying to discover the reason for sleep. And what I took from the fact that they couldn't figure out the reason for sleep was that you didn't need it. So I slept as little as possible. I probably have the world's largest sleep debt because I took my father's words the wrong way and decided, that if he didn't see a reason for sleep, then I must not need it. So, but how did he bring sleep into the home? It was in the home all the time. I mean, he was an incredible storyteller, very funny, and he would always tell us stories from the meetings, and I wish I could remember them well. But one of his stories was he gave a talk at a meeting, and he had a favorite joke he liked to tell, and he told his joke. It was very funny. Everybody laughed. At the end of the talk, he went back in the audience, and the next speaker was the Surgeon General. Surgeon General had not attended my father's talk, which insulted him a little bit. Surgeon General opened his talk with the same joke. Got no laugh. And my father said it was just priceless, because it was a very funny joke, and this man could not understand why no one was laughing, and didn't know that my dad had just told the joke. Another story he liked to tell, and I wish I could remember which sleep researcher it was, but he was giving a lecture in a big lecture hall, and suddenly it was as though he was having a seat. He just stopped in the middle of his lecture, and nobody knew what was happening. And they turned to my dad, and he said, and I can't remember exactly what bird, but it was a rare bird. He was a birder. And he said, "Bill, it's a Maryland warbler." Yeah, I don't think that's the right bird, but so we were always hearing things like that. But also I think he was always educating us, because I certainly knew the basics. And it was kind of funny. I brought my dad. I moved home to take care of him after my mother died. And so I brought him to the San Antonio meeting in 2017. And I sort of stepped, I wasn't in my family home since 1975. So to me, to see what the field had become and the depth of the science was just astonishing, because of how short a time period it was. 1958 I was born, so 1956 or so REM is described, and now we are have found the gene for narcolepsy, and we've got a way to treat sleep apnea, and the neurologists are, it's just incredible. And my father, he knew he was nearing the end of his life, and I think he was just so proud and so happy to see what the field had become, to see all these different disciplines cooperating, and it was a really profound experience. Yeah, I mean, he had an ego, my dad. He enjoyed he enjoyed being appreciated, but he equally appreciated other people's contributions. So many people have come up to me and said that my father was so generous with his help, so enthusiastic and supporting of their work. He didn't try to take other people's ideas for his own. There's a doctor who has basically become a very commercial sleep doctor, and he said, a lot of sleep researchers kind of scorned him because he was very commercial. And my father was like, are you helping people? He said, my father asked him, are you helping people? And he said, yes. And then he said, keep on. And he really, I could tell how much he appreciated that support from my dad, because his peers were not very supportive. And I know that, who's the lucid dreaming guy? Do you know? Blanking. Anyway, my dad was his thesis advisor for the original lucid dreaming work, and most people thought that was just a lot of hooey. But my dad was happy to support him. If there's a question, try and answer it. Do the research. My dad was profoundly intellectually curious. If there was a question, he wanted to answer it. When he first moved to the U.S., I saw him a lot because my mother was forever giving dinner parties, and so he would come over, and so I knew him then, but not so much in the meantime. But at the San Antonio meeting, Christian was taken ill and went to the hospital, and so I was able to take my father to visit him in the hospital. They hadn't seen, since my father was not doing well either, they hadn't seen each other in quite some time. So I took him to the hospital, which was distressing because Christian was very ill and had oxygen. So he couldn't talk unless he had to sort of choose between breathing and talking. But they had a nice short visit. And I said, the two of you changed the world together. Because I feel very strongly that my father stepped away fairly. He started the first sleep clinic in the world. I will acknowledge there's dispute about whether it was the first sleep clinic in the world, but it definitely was the first one that survived. There's some talk that some people in Europe started one, but they weren't able to make it work. And it was hard at the beginning. My father had to go looking for patients because no one would refer patients to the sleep clinic. I mean, I remember him talking a lot about that psychiatrists just, if you said you had insomnia, they'd just give you sleeping pills. And if you said you had if you had other things, a lot of times they just treated it as a mental illness. So that was part of why he was always lecturing. If the Elks wanted him to lecture, he would lecture. I think I mentioned before, in my high school psychology class, you could get extra credit for bringing in a speaker. So my dad spoke for all three kids for our psychology classes, but then he spoke to all our friends' psychology classes so they could get extra credit. So for years and years, he was speaking to the high school psychology classes. But if you think about it, then those people go out and they have sleep awareness, they have literacy, they maybe do a little better in college. Or if their parent gets sleep apnea, once they knew about sleep apnea, when he first started doing this, didn't know. But his class at Stanford, I can't tell you how many students have come back and said, you saved because of your class, I discovered that my mother had sleep apnea, or I made my father go in, or I have sleep apnea, and you saved my life. When he first taught the class. The reason the class started was that we bought a house. We lived on Stanford campus. We bought a new house, but we couldn't move into it for a year. And that year, Stanford had agreed to let the Black students on campus have a theme house that would be a third Black students, 2/3 everyone else. Because up until that point, every dorm had a few Black students. And so, as I understand it, part of their objection was, so how do the Blacks feel about this? How do the Blacks feel about that? And they just wanted to have some place where they could congregate. And there were no, in the Stanford dorms, you have to have a adult who's in charge of the dorm. In those days, it was a faculty resident. Now I think they can't get enough faculty, but at that time, they couldn't get any Black faculty members to agree to be the faculty person for the house. So they asked my parents if they would do it, and they agreed. Partly, I think, because it was a good idea, but partly because we needed somewhere to live for the year. And the dorm came with a little tiny house with 2 bedrooms for 5 of us, 1 bathroom, not really, sort of a kitchenette. So we ate most of our meals in the dorm. We kids, we would go to breakfast with our little tray, and they'd give us our sack lunch for school. And was one of the best experiences of our lives. And I still know many of those students. And my father was very close to them. And many of those students became doctors. And he and one of the students founded the Black Pre-Med Society at Stanford. And he was very involved with that for many, many years. My mother made paella dinner every year for the Black Pre-Med Society. But I don't know whose idea it was, but he, in that dorm, that dorm was 1975, no, not 1970, 1970. He gave a freshman seminar on sleep in the never-ending quest to educate. And they actually, you couldn't do this now, but they had a sleep lab in the basement. And he took his old pickup truck. My dad always was driving a big old beat up pickup truck, because in those days you had to move your EEG machines around. And so he borrowed an EEG machine, they put it in the basement of our dorm, and the students actually conducted research and put electrodes on each other, did little projects. But the students from the other dorms kept coming to the freshman seminar, and our students got upset because it was supposed to be our dorm seminar. And my father said, look, if you'll leave us alone, this is Cedro Dorm's seminar. Next quarter, next semester, whatever Stanford has, I'll give a course for the whole university. So that's what he did the next semester. I think Stanford's quarters. So the next quarter, he offered a class to the university, and something like 500 students signed up, and there was no room big enough to give the class. So they had him give the class in the Stanford church, which is a sort of cathedral-like church with a huge stained glass windows and a big long aisle. I eventually got married there because I wanted the longest aisle I could find. And so the first class for the university was given in that church. And the class is still going 52 or so years later. And they estimate that he taught about 10,000 students through that class. And they come back all the time to visit and to tell him their stories. Chuck and I snuck out of Club Hypnos and spent a long time talking about the class, because I want this to be about my dad, but I graduated from college, from Harvard also, and Chuck and I were both in the same house, Lowell House at Harvard, but 5 years apart. And I graduated from college 1979, and the World Sleep meetings were in Tokyo. And at the last minute, in the fall, or at the end of the summer, my mother decided not to go. And in those days, you could change a plane ticket. And so my dad took me. And so I attended the World Sleep meetings as daughter of honored guest, because in Japan at that time, he was the man. And my dad, he traveled so much that he wanted to go home the minute a meeting was over. And if I was going to Japan, I wanted to stay. So I extended my ticket for a week. And my dad, being protective, didn't want his little 21-year-old daughter traveling by herself. So he asked Chuck to look after me. He was Chuck's thesis advisor, so he knew Chuck well. And Chuck was staying for a week as well. And we never met each other, but then we traveled the next week in Japan together. And I was 5'10", and Chuck is very tall. And we got stopped all over Japan by people wanting to take their picture with us, even though they didn't know who we were because we were so tall. And we had this amazing, I don't know what possessed us. We decided to go river rafting in Japan. And we just got on a bus and went out into the middle of nowhere. And they sort of, mimed that we were going rafting, and they dropped us off, and there was nothing to say. We were not sure we weren't just abandoned. And did this river rafting trip that ended in in a lake where they were cormorant fishing, and it's really amazing. So anyway, I've known him ever since. We've been friends ever since. And since we both went to Harvard, I was very involved in my dad's class. I was asking him all about and I know the Harvard bureaucracy, so I imagined he had some difficulties. Yeah, he was telling me all the different evolutions of the course, and I found it fascinating. And he's tried some interesting things that I love. I taught high school, and so when I would go home, you think what worked, what didn't, what could I do better, and so I found a lot of his ideas really interesting. For my father, I think it was at that point, the world was so uneducated. It was more about driving home a few points, just make it as entertaining as possible so I can get as many people to take it as possible so that the word gets out. In fact, he had a book he loved called 1066 and all that. It was a little sort of pocket history book. And the idea was there are only a few dates you need to know. And 1066, Battle of Hastings, I think. And so he used to tell that story at the beginning of class. He'd tell them about the book 1066 and all that. And he'd say, and so in this class, it's like that. There are just certain points. I'm going to tell you a lot of stuff, but there are these critical points that I want you to take away from the class. And on the final exam, one of the questions was, what are you going to take away? Basically asking for one of those points. And one student wrote that what they would remember is 1066. And that became kind of a class joke for years. And so wherever my dad would go in the world, somebody would walk by and whisper in his ear, just in the New York sidewalk, 1066. And one time my parents were at a Bob Dylan concert, and a note came passed down the crowd. And when my dad opened the note, it said 1066. And so to me, that was always the buzzword for the class. And then I don't know when it changed, but now the buzzword in class is drowsiness is red alert. That's my dad's punchline. I never liked it, but as he became really concerned about driving safety, and as college students, are chronically sleep deprived, and so he started to worry about the fact a lot of Stanford students have cars, and who hasn't driven when they're too sleepy to drive. So his point was, if you're getting drowsy, that's an alarm bell. Drowsiness is red alert. And, his style was very different than what would be the Harvard style that I was used to. He was a consummate entertainer. So if students fell asleep in his class, he loved it, because he would have everybody be quiet, and then he'd have the students look, and then he'd squirt them with a squirt gun to wake them up, and ask them if they'd been dreaming, ask them what was the last thing they remembered in class, and just sort of use it as an object lesson. But you got extra credit if you fell asleep. Again, so I don't think they're the right meetings, but a couple of things I remember. When the meetings were smaller, they were not more social, but differently social, because now it's so big that you sort of have to divide people up, or if there's the big cocktail party, you're lucky if you can even find all the people you want to talk to. So in the olden days, you really could all gather. And so it was more of a thing to have an event that was unusual. So I remember one of the meetings that my dad hosted. He rented a ferry in the San Francisco Bay, and he had helped Stanford start a jazz program. He was very, very interested in jazz, considered jazz as a profession. And they'd gotten Stan Getz to be their artist in residence for a year. And so Stan Getz became a family friend. And because Stanford had Stan Getz's friends were coming through and playing concerts with Stan. And so I have photos of this ferry with all the sleeper searchers on it and Dizzy Gillespie. And there's a picture of my dad and on Dizzy with his, so I remember that. Another one I remember, I remember this, I wasn't there, but I have pictures and I heard about it. And it was memorable to me because I ended up moving to Columbus, Ohio. And Columbus, Ohio, the Columbus Zoo had Jack Hanna, who used to bring the animals on Letterman and was a real showman. And at that Columbus meeting, Tom Roth tells me it was an unofficial meeting. I thought it was the first APSS meeting, but unclear. Jack Hanna came to the meeting, and the zoo had 2 white tiger cubs, which is very unusual. And because my father was the president, he got to hold the white tiger cubs. And I have a picture of him holding these 2 little white tiger cubs. But his story was they got their claws in him, and it was quite painful.